"Sir, you need to stay right there." The security guard's arm came down like a gate, cutting off the old man's path to the exit. The store fell into that particular silence. People get when something ugly is happening, and they can't decide whether to intervene or reach for their phones. Most of them reached for their phones. Earl Langston was 71, thin-shouldered, wearing a cardigan that had seen better decades. He turned around with the careful movements of someone whose body no longer did things quickly by choice, and he looked at the guard with the bewildered expression of a man who was trying very hard to understand what was happening. "I paid," he said. "I paid for everything. Sir, we need you to empty your pockets." I paid at the register. His voice had started to tremble, not with anger, but with something older and harder to watch. "Please, I have my receipt." He fumbled in his coat. The receipt was there. Courtney Aldridge, the floor manager of Westgate Health and Wellness, examined it with the careful attention of someone who had already decided what they were looking for and didn't intend to find it. She held up a small amber bottle of prescription-grade fish oil supplements. It had come from Earl's inner coat pocket. Earl had no idea it was there. "You didn't pay for this," she said. "I didn't take it. It was in your coat." "I know that, but I didn't." He stopped, looked around the store. A small crowd had gathered in that instinctive, sidelong way of people who want to watch without appearing to watch. Nobody was looking at him with anything that might generously be called doubt. "Please," he said quietly. "I'm 71 years old. I didn't steal fish oil supplements." Courtney's expression didn't change. She had a practiced look of patient authority that people in her position developed over years of making decisions they were certain about. "We're going to need to wait for the police. Please come with me." Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The phones stayed up. Tatum Kessel was fourth in line at the checkout register when it started. She'd come in on her lunch break for multivitamins and had been standing there for 11 minutes watching the situation unfold, the vitamins still in her hand, her bag still on her shoulder, the voice in her head rotating through a familiar cycle. "Someone else will say something. There are plenty of people here. He probably has a daughter, a son, someone whose job this is." Nobody said anything. She set the vitamins down on a nearby shelf and walked over. "Excuse me." She kept her voice low and professional, the voice she used in client meetings when someone had made a significant arithmetic error and she didn't want to embarrass them. "I think there might be a misunderstanding." Courtney looked at her. The look was brief and comprehensive. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me enough." Tatum didn't move. "Has anyone checked whether he might have accidentally picked it up? Someone could have put it in his pocket without realizing. These aisles are crowded. We have security footage." "Then let's look at it." "Ma'am, he's been standing here for 10 minutes and nobody has looked at the footage." Tatum kept her tone even. "Can we at least do that before the police arrive?" Courtney's patience had a visible edge to it now. She nodded to the guard. The guard moved toward Tatum. Not threateningly, exactly. More the way someone moves furniture, assuming it will simply relocate. He put his hand on her shoulder and pushed. She stumbled sideways into the display shelf. Her shoulder hit the edge of a metal rack. Supplements scattered across the floor. She caught herself, stood up, took a breath. Every part of her wanted to leave. She had been leaving rooms like this her entire life. Rooms where she'd overstepped, spoken too loudly, been too much or not enough. She knew exactly how to leave. She'd gotten very good at it. She planted her feet and didn't move. "You can do that again," she said, looking at the guard and then at Courtney. "I'll still be standing here." The silence in the store changed. It wasn't comfortable silence before, but now it was the kind that had weight. The police arrived 7 minutes later. A senior officer separated everyone, asked for the footage, and watched it twice without comment. A teenager in noise-cancelling headphones had been reaching past Earl at the supplement display, juggling a basket and a text conversation, and had knocked the bottle cleanly into Earl's open coat pocket without noticing. She'd walked out 10 minutes before anyone realized the bottle was missing. The officer looked at Courtney for a long moment. Before detaining this gentleman and calling law enforcement, did anyone review the cameras? Courtney's confidence had developed a hairline fracture. It appeared suspicious. He's 71, and he had a receipt in his pocket. I understand, but appearing suspicious isn't the same thing as being suspicious, the officer said flatly. That's not a difficult distinction. The apology Courtney gave afterward was the kind people give when a lawyer's card is somewhere in the room. She addressed a point roughly between Earl's shoulder and the wall behind him. Earl listened. Then he said quietly, I hope the next person you suspect gets treated the way you'd want your own father treated. Those 10 words did more damage to Courtney Aldridge's composure than anything the officer had said. Tatum walked Earl to his car. It was cold outside, that particular March cold in Chicago that reminded you the city had strong opinions about the concept of spring. They talked about ordinary things. He asked what she did. She said bookkeeping small business clients mostly. She had her own practice. He nodded as if she'd told him something he already knew. She gave him her card when he said his finances had gotten away from him. He took it with both hands and said he'd be in touch. She didn't think about it again for 3 days. The brownstone on North Lincoln had 5 bedrooms. A security system sophisticated enough to require its own maintenance contract. And staff who had learned to read their employers' silences the way navigators read weather, not waiting for the storm to arrive, but noting every subtle change in pressure. Leandro Cruz had been at the dining table for 4 minutes before he noticed his father's left wrist. He set his water glass down. What happened? Earl waved his free hand. Nothing worth discussing. Dad. The word was quiet. It didn't need to be anything else. Leandro Cruz had spent 20 years building an organization where his calm voice was something people feared more than shouting, and his father had spent those same 20 years being the one person immune to it. But he told the story anyway. When Earl finished, the table was very still. Leandro's security chief, Cyrus, who had been standing near the doorway, was now paying close attention to the ceiling. Nobody in the room was unaware of their employer's expression. It wasn't anger. Anger was loud and unpredictable, and Leandro Cruz was neither. What was on his face was something quieter and therefore more permanent. He picked up his phone, he set it down again. He looked at his father's wrist once more. The woman who stepped in, he said. Tell me her name. Cyrus had the surveillance footage within 40 minutes. Leandro watched it twice without speaking, once for the incident itself, and once with his attention fixed on a single figure. A woman in a blazer and work skirt who set down her shopping basket, walked into a situation that was none of her business, got shoved into a metal rack, stood back up, and then held her ground with the kind of stillness that isn't fearlessness, but is somehow harder, knowing you're afraid and staying anyway. Tatum Kessel, Cyrus said. Bookkeeping practice on Armitage. She's been there 3 years. Clients are mostly small restaurants and non-profits. Nothing unusual. Background. Clean. No connections to anyone I recognize. Leandro looked at the paused frame. Tatum Kessel had her feet planted and her chin level, and there was something in her posture that was simultaneously braced and completely settled. Don't approach her, he said. Don't let her know anyone's watching. I just want to know who she is. Cyrus exchanged a brief look with the man beside him. Those instructions were unusual. Most people who caught Leandro Cruz's attention were approached within 24 hours, generally by someone considerably taller than themselves. Yes, sir, Cyrus said. Earl appeared in the doorway with his reading glasses on. "I'm going to go see about the bookkeeping," he said pleasantly, to no one in particular. Leandro did not tell him not to. Kessel Bookkeeping Services occupied the second floor of a narrow building that had a vintage clothing store below it and a persistent draft that came through the north window from October through April. Tatum had named the building's boiler Gerald. She had plants on the windowsill that were doing well because she actually remembered to water them, a covered bridge photograph on the wall that she'd bought at a flea market because the light in it was calming, and a coffee pot that she refilled more times per day than was strictly advisable. Earl Langston came in on a Thursday with a manila folder of receipts that were, Tatum discovered after 20 minutes, extremely well organized. "You said your finances had gotten away from you," she said. He looked at the folder. "They got away from me, and then I caught them." "When?" "Years ago." She looked at him over her reading glasses. He looked back with the patient expression of a man who had somewhere to be, but was in no hurry to get there. She refilled his coffee and they talked for 2 hours. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and by April he was a fixture on her Thursday afternoons, the client who stayed long after the work was done, who asked what she was reading, who listened to her talk about difficult clients the way her grandfather used to, not waiting to respond, but actually listening. She started setting aside the good coffee for Thursdays. "My son is single," he mentioned one afternoon in late April, approximately as casually as someone drops a hammer. Tatum didn't look up from her screen. Every grandfather says that. "I'm saying it because it's relevant." "It's not relevant." "He's a good man. He takes care of things." Earl considered his coffee cup. "He's not easy to know, but he's worth knowing." Tatum finally looked at him. "Mr. Langston, whatever your son does, whoever he is, a man with resources and influence, and whatever you're implying about him, he wants someone who fits into his life, who looks like she belongs there." She said it gently, without self-pity, the way someone states a practical fact. "That's not me." Earl was quiet for a moment. "Then, what does belonging look like?" She didn't have a good answer for that. She went back to her spreadsheet. Earl drank his coffee and said nothing else about it, which somehow felt like the conversation wasn't over. The first time Leandro Cruz walked into Kessel Bookkeeping, Tatum was on a call with a restaurant client who had somehow managed to categorize staff meals as equipment depreciation for 3 consecutive quarters. She held up one finger without looking at the door. He waited. She finished the call, turned around, and saw a man in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, with the kind of stillness that wasn't relaxation, but something deliberate, something practiced. She had an instinct about people from years of sitting across desks from them. She could read discomfort, evasion, anxiety, the particular guilt of people who'd let their books go for 18 months and were now hoping she'd be kind about it. This man had none of those things. He had the quality of someone who was always the most certain person in the room. She extended her hand. "Tatum Kessel, what kind of mess are we dealing with?" He blinked. "Just once, Leandro," he said. "What's the last name, Leandro?" A pause. "Cruz." "Okay, Cruz." She pulled up a new file. "Real estate your father mentioned? Walk me through it." For the next 45 minutes, she asked sharp, specific questions, and he answered most of them, and deflected a few, and she noted where the deflections were, with the attention of someone filing information for later. She wasn't intimidated by complicated finances. She was, if anything, more interested in them. When he left, she handed him her intake form. "It's long, but don't let that scare you." "I don't scare easily." Everybody says that before page 4. He came back twice more that month. The third time, after the actual business was resolved, They talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. She told him about Gerald, the boiler. He asked about the covered bridge photograph and listened to the full answer, including the flea market context and her theory about why certain light felt safe. She asked him questions that were direct without being rude, the questions of someone who was genuinely curious and didn't bother pretending otherwise. He drove home and sat in the parked car for a few minutes before going inside. Cyrus, the following morning, placed his weekly report on the desk and said only, "Nothing unusual. She's exactly what she appears to be." Leandro read it and said nothing. Earl looked pleased at dinner. The gala invitation arrived at the office on a Tuesday. Earl delivered it personally, which should have been Tatum's first indication that something was happening. He said it was for the children's oncology wing at Northwestern, that his family had supported it for years, that it would mean a great deal to him personally if she would attend. She almost said no. She did say no, and then Earl looked at her with a particular variety of patience, and she said she'd think about it, which both of them understood to mean yes. She rented a dress, deep green, simple, well-fitted. She stood outside the venue in the cold for 90 full seconds, talking herself into walking through the doors. She found Earl in the first 10 minutes, which stabilized everything. She made him laugh twice. She successfully discussed hydrangeas with Earl's wife Dolores for 6 minutes, without knowing anything about hydrangeas. She was doing fine. She was actually doing fine. She didn't see Courtney Aldridge until the woman was already crossing the room toward her. Recognition moved across Courtney's face, and then something else moved in behind it, the particular expression of someone who has decided to make a point and has selected their moment. "I remember you," Courtney said. She didn't bother keeping her voice down. The walk-in from Westgate, the one who made such a scene. "I think you might be misremembering how that went," Tatum said. "You caused a disruption over nothing." Courtney let her gaze travel over Tatum in the unhurried way of someone conducting an inspection and finding the results predictable. "And now you're here. What exactly are you here as?" "I was invited." "By whom? Are you with the catering staff?" Someone nearby went quiet. Then the quiet spread in a radius, the way it always did. Tatum recognized this. The room watching. The weight of it. She kept her voice even. "I'm here as a guest. Women like you spend their whole lives trying to walk into rooms where they don't belong." Courtney stepped closer. Her voice dropped in a way that made it somehow more audible. "It must be so exhausting." She reached out and took Tatum's wrist. Tatum looked at the hand. She took a breath. She was about to say something, had the sentence ready, calm and precise, when a voice came from her right. Let go of her. Quiet, completely level. The kind of voice that didn't need volume because it carried something else in it, something older than volume. Courtney turned. Leandro Cruz had materialized from somewhere in the ballroom. He was in a dark suit, and he was looking at Courtney with an expression that was not angry. Anger was too simple a word. It was the expression of a man doing an extremely precise calculation. Courtney's hand dropped on its own. Leandro stepped to Tatum's side, not in front of her, beside her. The ballroom had gone entirely still in the way that ballrooms do when someone very powerful decides to make something their business. People knew who Leandro Cruz was. People who knew who Leandro Cruz was understood, on a fairly instinctive level, that his undivided attention was not something to be sought carelessly. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Courtney. "The woman you just put your hand on," he said, "walked into a crowded store 6 weeks ago because an elderly man was being detained for something he didn't do, and no one else was willing to say so. She took a shove she didn't earn. She stood up and didn't leave." He paused. "My father was the elderly man. She didn't know that. She still doesn't know." He stopped, looked at Tatum briefly. She didn't know it then. He turned back to Courtney. You told her she doesn't belong here, he said. You are the least qualified person in this building to make that determination. Courtney's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You've confused a good dress for standing, Leandro said, with the calm of someone completing a math problem. They're not the same thing. They've never been the same thing. He looked at Tatum. His expression was different when it landed on her. Not softer, exactly, but it had stopped being the expression he used for the rest of the room. Are you all right? I'm deciding, she said. They're serving the lamb. It tends to help. She almost laughed. She did laugh, actually, a short and slightly unwilling sound. And something in his face shifted by a degree so small that probably no one else in the ballroom caught it. He offered his arm. She took it. The city looked different from the car on the way home. Or maybe it looked the same, and she was what was different. Your father, she said, somewhere past Michigan Avenue. Yes. He's been visiting my office for 2 months. He has. His accounts were perfectly organized. They've been organized for years. She looked out the window. I kept seeing him anyway. I know, Leandro said. He told me. He also told me you make the better coffee. I do make the better coffee. They drove for another block. She could feel him choosing his words carefully, which was different from how he usually spoke. She'd learned, in the accumulated Thursday hours and the 3 professional visits, and now this strange evening, that Leandro Cruz said things once and meant them precisely, and didn't offer them lightly. Thank you, he said finally, for what you did for him. I didn't know who he was. I know. I mean that I genuinely didn't know. I know that too, he said quietly. That's the point. He took her to lunch 4 days later at a cafe near the river that was quiet and served good soup, and where nobody important was likely to notice him, which she realized later was something he'd thought about deliberately. He placed a magazine on the table. She looked at the cover, looked at him, looked at the cover again. You manage some real estate, she said. That is technically accurate. And the other part. He didn't flinch from it. He told her the way she'd come to expect him to tell her things, directly, without ornamentation, starting from the beginning. The Cruz organization, what it was and what it had been, what he'd spent 10 years restructuring, and why, what rules existed now that hadn't existed before. He told her about the violence he'd stepped between, and the violence he'd ended, and the parts that couldn't be made clean. She listened, she didn't interrupt. Her hands were wrapped around her coffee cup, and she was looking at him with the particular attention she gave to complicated things. Not alarmed, but not pretending not to understand the weight of it either. I own a 2-room office, she said when he finished, above a vintage clothing store. I know. Last March I had to decide between renewing my lease and upgrading my software. The lease, he said. You chose the lease. She looked at him. How long have you known all of that? 2nd visit. You kept coming. You gave me work. He paused, and then I ran out of work and kept coming anyway. She looked down at her coffee. Outside, people walked past the window, with their coats pulled close, living their ordinary lives at their ordinary scale. You want to say you're too ordinary for this, he said, that you don't fit, that a man like me, a man like you, she said, would want something different. His voice was patient and exact. I won't argue that you and I live different lives. That's true. What's not true is that different means incompatible. He held her gaze. I watched footage of you for 1 hour, before I ever met you. And I noticed, before anything else, before the question of courage or character, or the things my father said about you, I noticed that you were beautiful. She went still. The kind that's easy to miss if you're moving quickly, he said. I wasn't moving quickly. I noticed the way you stood, the way you held yourself when you were certain about something versus uncertain. I noticed you. He didn't look away. Not because of who you were inside, despite how you looked. Because of you, all of it together. The cafe was very quiet around them. That's a terrifying amount of directness, she said. It saves time. You keep saying that. It keeps being true. She turned her coffee cup in her hands, thinking. Then she set it down and looked at him, and something that had been held carefully in her expression for the past several weeks settled differently, like a thing that had been braced and decided it didn't need to be anymore. Okay, she said. It wasn't everything. It was the beginning of everything, which is a different and more useful thing. 6 months later, Tatum Kessel's bookkeeping practice had a third room, a second full-time employee, and a waiting list. 2 non-profit clients from the Cruise Foundation had found their way to her through legitimate referrals, and from there word had spread in the organic and unremarkable way that word spreads when someone is genuinely good at what they do. She'd earned it without shortcuts, and she knew it, which mattered to her in a way she didn't feel the need to explain to anyone. She still wore the cardigans. She still called the boiler Gerald, because it had sounded right the first time, and the name had stuck. She still made too much coffee, and worked through difficult problems with a particular private expression that meant she'd reached a conclusion and hadn't announced it yet. The difference was, she'd stopped apologizing for the space she took up. At the Langston Cruise family dinner on a Sunday in October, Dolores asked the question over dessert. She directed it at Leandro, but her eyes went to Tatum with the warm satisfaction of a woman who had made up her mind months ago. "When did you know?" she said. Leandro considered it. "The footage," he said. "She got shoved and stood back up and didn't leave. But it wasn't the bravery that got me." He was quiet for a moment. She didn't look brave. She looked like the decision was already made, and she was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. He glanced at Tatum briefly. "That's a specific kind of person. I've spent a long time trying to find people like that." Earl was looking at his dessert with the contented expression of a man who had done what he set out to do and was gracious enough not to point it out. Tatum was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He walked into my office and waited while I finished a phone call." Dolores raised an eyebrow. "Nobody makes him wait," Tatum said. "I didn't know that. I just had a call to finish." She looked at Leandro. He waited. Leandro said, "You had a client. You could have interrupted. You would have been annoyed." "I would have been annoyed," she agreed. Dolores looked between them for a moment, and then looked at Earl, who was still looking at his dessert, still saying nothing. Later, on the back porch, while Earl dozed in the armchair, the way Earl always did after dinner, Tatum stood at the railing with her coffee and let the night air come around her. Chicago in October had a particular smell, lake water and wood smoke, and something that wasn't quite cold yet but knew it was coming. She thought about a pharmacy on Michigan Avenue and a 17-year-old in headphones who had no idea she'd changed anything. She thought about a cardigan and a card she'd handed over without thinking. She thought about standing up from a metal rack shelf and the particular quality of silence when a room doesn't know what to do with you. She thought about the covered bridge photo still on her office wall, and how she'd never gotten around to replacing it, because actually she still liked it there. The door behind her opened. Leandro came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. After a while, she leaned slightly into his shoulder, and he shifted to make room for her, without comment, without ceremony. The way people do when making room for someone is simply what you do. "For the record," she said, "I still think you're somewhat terrifying." "For the record," he said, "you're the only person who's said that to my face and made it sound like a reasonable thing to be." She smiled into her coffee. Inside, Earl's soft snoring was audible through the glass door. He'd done exactly what he'd intended to do, and in exactly the way he'd intended to do it. He was, as Leandro had once told a room full of men who should have known better, the only person in Chicago he didn't win arguments with. The city held its lights steady across the dark, and Tatum Kessel, who had spent more years than she cared to count, making herself smaller in rooms that didn't ask her to, but seemed to expect it, stood at a railing with her coffee and let herself take up exactly as much of the evening as she wanted. It turned out that was precisely the right amount. It had always been precisely the right amount. She was only now done pretending otherwise.